The show exploded early into its run. This huge surge of people paying attention to the medium had many results, since all of a sudden thousands, and later millions of people, were all tuning into the same show delivered in a seemingly novel audio format. And truthfully, many of these people were too unprepared to responsibly consume it. The people featured within the podcast of its story were later harassed by superfans of Serial in their private residences of all places. This problem, of course, is not unique to podcasting. After all, true crime and investigative journalism programming existed previously, but the scope of this medium is much larger, multiplying the magnitude of any problems that result from it. So today, as my thesis, I'd like to point out that this podcast specifically is only for entertainment value, and everything else around it that increases that is not to present the most honest view on the subject. Just be fun to listen to. The impact of this podcast is great, but for the average person who has no other involvement in this, there is no reason for them to pay attention other than the entertainment of it. The amount of coverage of this case was not necessary in terms of actually bringing justice to a legal system or legal proceeding that was potentially unjust or biased. There also could be issues in bias resulting from this podcast in many ways, depending on how much the hosts or other parties within it interact with Adnan Syed. He is someone who is shown to be extremely charming throughout, being able to convincingly sound like he is an innocent person locked up in prison. But that's also the impression that Sarah Koenig had. Koenig, hosting the podcast herself, quite repeatedly appears to be fascinated and skewed by what Adnan Syed has to say. And the bias from people who interact with Adnan Syed is a very big issue because Sarah Koenig could be influenced by his charm to be predispositioned to specific conclusions about his character. The character traits of Adnan Syed seem very reasonable at first, and people who were close to him in school recognize that he was a relatively kind seeming person to be around. When being actively swayed by charm or charisma, the medium itself becomes much less effective at communicating proper truth. Even if, again, the point of the podcast was not to ever convey the truth directly, but more so to be an entertaining story. Also, people are being quiet. A lot of people. In fact, this entire podcast had people saying a fraction of what they knew. And that's, of course, natural. Most people don't want to reveal much of the information that they know because it is potentially incriminating in this case. Which is why it's important to express a lot of skepticism towards what anyone ever says in these crime cases. Koenig herself actually does it quite often, as any reasonable journalist should. But honestly, from my perspective, the podcast wasn't harsh enough on Adnan Syed's guilt. I would like to acknowledge that the sources of this episode were all from the podcast itself and the Serial podcast website. Other than that, everything else was TCPC's own effort and opinions. Thanks for listening to this mini episode, and bye.